Hello, A-Push. Welcome to Period 6, one of my favorite time periods of American history. A very, very interesting time, covers a lot of ground, so we're going to just sort of jump right into it. Period 6 is all about the years 1865 to 1898. So we're talking about sort of the end of the Civil War and how that sort of creates this new country in a lot of ways, up to basically the war that we get into with Spain, the Spanish-American War. That's not covered in this period. That's covered in period 7, and we'll get to that next time. But that's sort of where it bumps up to the sort of big change in terms of how America is seen in the world. So obviously, post-war expansion, right? Like the war ends in 1865. And there's a couple things that I want you guys to focus on. First, this first theme is going to be post-war expansion. So obviously we have new economic opportunities in the West, and we see the government trying to support a lot of these. Opportunities like mining, especially there's silver rushes, gold rushes, kind of in Nevada, Idaho, obviously California that happened in period 5. But there's government policies are also helping with things like farming, right? Like the Homestead Act, helping with cattle. Cattle becomes a huge industry in this time, and we see sort of the destruction of the buffalo because of this sort of new setting up of big farms to graze cattle. So we have government policies like the Homestead Act, as I mentioned, in 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act, which also gives a lot of government land super cheap to railroad companies, so they can obviously connect the country. And then the Morrill Land Grant Acts, which are really about college. It sets up sort of this land that's being given to set up public colleges, and so that leads to huge universities like the University of Wisconsin, UC Berkeley, which is just in our backyard. But yeah, so government policy is really supporting the new westward expansion post-Civil War. Obviously, we also have the continuance of the removal of native peoples. We're going to see that sort of in what are called the Indian Wars, sort of a lot of small battles and massacres and things like that are happening against the indigenous tribes who live in these lands that the American government is trying to help white Americans come to and settle. We obviously also see subsidies for the railroads. Railroads are a really important industry happening at this time, and the government wants to support them. We also see the conservation movement come up, this idea of what's the government's kind of role in inland and the control of that land, right? There's the sense that the water and land and resources are going to be talked about in terms of what should we do with them? Should we put them aside into what will eventually be sort of national parks, or should they be open for corporate interests to sort of use? And so we're going to see that a big push. Someone like John Muir comes up, who starts the Sierra Club in 1892. The Department of Interior is created a little bit before Period 6, but obviously becomes a big part of it in Period 6. The U.S. Fish Commission, this idea of taking care of sort of U.S. fisheries. So this sort of leads us into the native policy of the American government. And you could say federal government, obviously states deal with them in different ways as well. But the federal policy was sort of one of two things. The first is violent conflict, right? We have these sort of conflicts, as I mentioned, these sort of Indian wars. A couple specific ones to note. The Sand Creek Massacre that happens in Colorado in 1864, so it's a little bit before this period, but important. The Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, we talked about that a little bit in the last video. That's in 1876. General Custer, Civil War veteran, he takes his last stand against Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And we also have the Ghost Dance movement, a super important sort of new spiritual movement where a shaman named Wovoka he's a Lakota Sioux, and he creates this big movement where many native shaman, medicine men, and others are sort of collecting and coming together to dance and become deeply sort of entrenched in spirituality, in the hopes that this sort of new movement will bring the sort of spirits to push away these white settlers, to push away sort of white influence and power over these lands, and bring back the buffalo. And ultimately, it is not a success, and it kind of culminates in the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, kind of the last sort of the last push by the government to sort of clear out these indigenous lands violently, and that's in 1890. We also, of course, have assimilation, right? So if not violence, we have assimilation, right? We have treaties, things like that. Specifically, we have tribes forced into reservations. We have the the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. We have other reservations set up. There's the Great Sioux Reserve in what is now Nebraska. We have the Dawes Severalty Act, which is a law passed in 1887 that sort of pushes for tribal ownership to end, for them to take on sort of land as if they were white settlers and farm them, but the land is owned by the government if they cannot comply. And then, of course, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which we talked about in class, that's in Pennsylvania. This idea that these schools are going to be created. I believe there are around 30 to focus on Americanizing the children of these indigenous peoples. And again, famously, the founder of the Carlisle School said that he wanted to kill the Indian to save the man. And this sort of context is really important to think about in this time. So obviously the other thing we have besides this westward expansion is huge industrialization. This is going to be a big piece of the DBQ that you guys will be writing this week. So industrialization, just to give you a sense, before the war, about 80% of the country live sort of in the countryside, in farms, basically agriculture. And by 1900, so only about 35 years later, 2/3 of Americans are practicing wage labor. They work for wages. So it's a huge transition. And obviously, in this transition, there's a lot of reasons for that and some reactions and effects of that. So we have this new industrialization, right? Even ramping up more than the market revolution. We kind of paused a little bit during the Civil War, but huge, large-scale production is happening. New technologies, improved communication, and really maximizing the exploitation of resources and labor, right, and workers. And these are huge themes to think about in terms of how people are treating workers and the things that they're working on. We have the sort of rise of these sort of captains of industry, if you want to be nice about it, or robber barons if you don't. And these are sort of lenses with which to look at these sort of really mega rich, powerful dudes, people like Andrew Carnegie, who is a steel magnate, John D. Rockefeller, an oil magnate, basically super rich, wealthy dudes in charge of these, basically monopolies on these. And so the idea of monopolies comes from the business practices I want to focus on, called horizontal integration and vertical integration. So horizontal, if you think about like horizontal, like sort of, collect like side by side, this idea that horizontal integration is going to control all the competition in a particular industry. And you're going to try to consolidate those companies, you buy them up, you put you create pools where you put your other members of your board on other boards to kind of control them. So that's horizontal integration, right? Controlling everything side to side. Vertical integration is this idea that you're controlling all aspects of manufacturing, all the way from extraction of the natural raw materials to sort of the finished product. So if you think about someone like Andrew Carnegie, he's a steel magnate, right? You own the mine that the workers are mining. You take that raw sort of iron ore, and you own the railroad lines and the cars that bring that ore to the factories that Carnegie also owns, which makes turns them into steel, which he owns, which he then gets to sell. So you own kind of every step on the ladder from the extraction of the resource to the finished product that you're selling. So that's vertical integration. Definitely know those two and how they're different. There's obviously a lot of attempts to reduce and eliminate competition, right? Like, this is laissez-faire capitalism, let it be, this idea that the government is going to stay out, right? There's no restrictions. And so generally these big sort of magnates of industry, they want to be the only one in their business so they can make all the money. So you have this attempt to really create these monopolies. They're also called trusts, and sort of, as I mentioned, pools. And so not only do we see the government sort of staying out of a lot of the practices, but also we have the ideas and ideologies that create the justification for this. And we remember from class this idea of social Darwinism, right? This sort of classic sort of taking the biological understanding of evolution and sort of Darwin's Origin of Species and putting it onto a sociological bent. People like Herbert Spencer in England, a sociologist, argue that survival of the fittest is actually in our culture, in our society as well. That basically those who are wealthy and powerful are that way genetically or sort of naturally for a reason, and their ancestors were better than the others, and it legitimizes and justifies this idea. The other thing that's happening, of course, is there's this attempt to industrialize the South, and it's called sort of the New South, this idea that we're going to change the South after the Civil War, that we're going to transform it from this, agricultural sort of backwards sort of, slave society before the war to this idea of like, we're going to bring the New South, more industry, more manufacturing, more technology. And so they try to, put factories in, specifically textile factories, places like Atlanta, so you get big cities really growing and a lot of, government trying to help them out. But of course, generally speaking, we still have the South remaining a really focused agricultural society. We have a lot of tenant farming, sharecropping, which is the idea that you get permission to farm on a piece of land, and someone owns that land, and then you have to pay your share of, you give your sort of product, you give a share of it to the person whose land it is, and then you get to keep some of the rest, and you get to sell that at whatever prices you can. And this idea really keeps a lot of people in this sort of, basically below the poverty line, like just basically living to survive, hand to mouth, for a long, long time. And specifically, a lot of former slaves and Black Americans in the South are generally sharecroppers. This is their only opportunity to make any money, have any living. There are white sharecroppers as well, and white tenant farmers, but certainly many African Americans, probably most at this time in the South, were sharecroppers. So the other thing to know, sort of big theme in terms of the Industrial Revolution, is we have lots of new economic opportunities, right? Like economic opportunities for many, many people. Specifically, we have immigrants, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, this idea of new immigrants coming from abroad, from other countries, to come and work. And obviously, we have those, poor farmers in America who are looking to move to cities to try to find a job in these new factories as well. So new economic opportunities. Also, we have a new development of career opportunities for women, right? For women to work in factories, to women to create new sort of middle-class jobs. And we have African-American opportunities as well, right? Like, despite the social prejudice and discrimination that African-American and women face, we have this sense that this Gilded Age is going to lead to some new opportunities, right? Economically, culturally, and despite the pushes against these sort of the acceptance that these groups will want to have, ultimately these new opportunities will help them get there. So I want to pivot to sort of the workers specifically. So those who are working in these industries, right? So one of the things that's happening, of course, is the organization of labor, right? So there's two big labor unions I want you guys to know about. The first is the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor, spelled like Knight, right? The Knights of Labor is founded in 1869. And it's a very open labor union, right? It's skilled workers, unskilled workers, you don't have to be skilled. Women are allowed in, African Americans, like a very open union. If you want to be part of this union for collective bargaining and collective action, you can be part of it. And it does really well for a while. They're able to argue and bargain and strike, even though that's not technically legal. However, this union is kind of seen as radical, specifically when the Haymarket Affair happens, and that's basically a strike that happens in Chicago, and leads to like sort of a bombing and the death of a few police officers, which leads to sort of this idea that unions are anarchists, they are radical, they will kill people to strike, and it definitely leads to sort of a huge decline. In 1886, that's when the Haymarket Affair happens, and coincidentally, The rise of the second union that I want you guys to know is in 1886. It's the American Federation of Labor. It still exists today, AFL-CIO. That's AFL is part of it, the American Federation of Labor. And this is a labor union that kind of takes a different tack than the Knights of Labor. They focus on skilled workers. They want professional sort of guild members who are going to be sort of the cream of the crop. Obviously, they are going to be generally white men. They are going to be discriminatory against women, against people of color. They're not allowed in, and unskilled as well. It's definitely a more conservative labor union, not just in their membership, but also just in the way that they fight for, and the things they fight for. They fight for things that feel easier for governments to sort of decide on, kind of more moderate things like working conditions, hours, weekly or daily hours, things that feel like they're easier to talk about than like radical changes of systems. And by 1900, this is the largest union in the country. So in terms of labor movements in general, I think sort of talking about some of the successes and some of the failures is really important. So overall, successes. Local and national unions are pushing to get more power, right? And they want, they can bargain collectively and they can get people to strike. And so it kind of leads to this big rise of a national labor movement where you have kind of famous leaders, people like Eugene V. Debs, Mother Jones, sort of these leaders, Samuel Gompers, the leader of the American Federation of Labor, people who are sort of important figures in the fight for labor and for labor rights. It obviously also will lead to the rise of some new political power and attempts at power. So groups like the Socialist Party, the People's or Populist Party, which we're going to talk about shortly. So those are a lot of successes. Obviously also, though, there are a lot of failures. Specifically, some of the major strikes that happen are put down effectively by the local and federal government. So we have the Homestead Strike in 1892. We have the Pullman Strike we talked about in class in 1894, where these strikes are kind of broken by either private kind of Pinkerton guards or the militias, right? Local or federal militias. And they break up these strikes and due to court injunctions and the ability for federal and local governments to be able to call the militias in and break those strikes. It also these unions lead to divisions, right? Especially between groups like based on gender or ethnicity or race or skill. So we have this huge hostility within these groups. You see with the Knights of Labor and the way that falls, this sort of this idea that we're going to go slower and a little bit more narrow, and how that discrimination even internally leads to a lot of infighting and a lot of problems, and obviously lack of success. And obviously corporations are hostile to labor unions. They want to create those monopolies. They want as much, sort of capital and profit as they can, and labor unions are arguing for better conditions, higher pay, shorter work hours, and they can't maximize their profits as best they could before. And so there's a lot of hostility, violence against these groups by not only by corporations, but again by the federal and local governments that are pleaded to by these rich owners who ask the federal government, people like Grover Cleveland, who breaks the Pullman strike. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike is broken by Rutherford B. Hayes. So, this becomes a huge problem. So the next group that we sort of talked about a little bit with the Populist Party is this group of farmers, right? So while there's a huge mass urbanization happening, there's also farmers who, in much of the country, are still dealing with huge changes. One of the things they're adapting to, of course, is mechanized agriculture, right? So more technology leads to easier yield, ways to sort of harvest and get crops. Obviously, there's also a dependence on railroads because these crops that are grown in the West have to be then sent to market, and so you need railroads. And there's some problems, kind of 5 big problems. One of them is that there's falling prices. So again, that mechanized agriculture leads to more production, which leads to lower prices, so they can't make as much money. Unfair railroad business practices. So railroads, again, in laissez-faire capitalism, can kind of do whatever they want with the government kind of hiding their eyes against it. You have expensive machinery. It's expensive to buy these new especially high quality threshing machines and things like that, you have a very tight money supply. There's not a lot of cash available because of this idea of bimetallism and the gold standard. So not a lot of cash to be able to buy these things, and there's really high tariffs. So this idea of protectionism, of we want Americans to buy American products, but if you want to sell your products to Europe, you have to pay this extra tax, and so these farmers are kind of left out. They're hurting. So there's a big organization that starts to happen. We have the Grange movement, which kind of organizes social, educational, and political activities. We have the Farmers Alliance, and separately because it was discriminatory, we have the Colored Farmers Alliance. You have the rise of political power in the populist party, right? It's called the People's Party. And we looked at that Omaha platform from 1892. And the Omaha platform sort of creates this third party, which becomes actually pretty successful, at least locally and to some extent federally. We have sort of some arguments that this group is making are government ownership of railroads, sort of this collective idea that if this is how we're going to get things to market, then the government should be in charge of it, in charge of regulating it and owning it. They believed in bimetallism, this free, unlimited coinage of silver, that silver and gold should be able to be exchanged for cash, because more Westerners, farmers, had more silver than gold. Gold was much more of a Northeast banker type metal coin. They believed in the direct election of senators. They wanted, at this time, senators were still elected by local legislatures. So they wanted that American public to be able to vote for senators, which, by the way, now we have. So populists are the ones who started that idea. They also wanted this idea of a graduated income tax, this idea that everyone should pay a tax on their income, and that should be paid more by people who had more money, the rich. This also is something we have. And then finally, this use of local political power, that things like referendums and initiatives should be able to be passed locally. We also have things like that, like when you have a proposition, or when you legalize marijuana, it started as a proposition, or things like that. Sort of local instances can then lead to larger state or federal laws and decisions. So into that, let's talk about the role of government. Now, we talk about this as the Gilded Age, and so obviously this sort of golden exterior belies kind of a rotten foundation. So in a lot of ways, government is tied to those big businesses, right? They are beholden to the powers that be. They believe in this laissez-faire, or let it be, let it lie government, where basically government's going to stay out, right? However, we do start to see some government regulations. We see things like the Wabash case, which we talked about in class. It was in 1886. This idea that that Supreme Court decides that states can't regulate interstate commerce, and so in response to that, the Congress passes this Interstate Commerce Act. So this idea that you can restrict or certainly limit some sort of trade between states. That's in 1887. They also created a sort of a separate government committee and bureaucracy that was going to overlook these things. So obviously that's a little bit of regulation. We also, of course, see, importantly, the Sherman Antitrust Act, this idea in 1890 that it's a law that tries to sort of outlaw monopolies, not allow them to do certain price fixing and things like that monopolies were doing. Now, with that said, it wasn't very successful. It didn't have very strong enforcement, and it actually was used in a lot of ways to call labor unions monopolies, which then really hollowed out a lot of the abilities for labor unions to be able to argue for more rights. So the other thing that I want to sort of get into is this idea of the movement of people, right? Both from outside the United States, externally, and also internally. And so in the country, we have, again, a lot of people who are moving to the West, so opportunities kind of on the frontier, which, again, eventually, if you remember from that Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis, the frontier thesis about the frontier closing in 1896, but this idea that the frontier is going to give opportunities for sort of, American frontier, starting it over, doing it right on our own. And again, laws like the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, things that are really going to benefit people who are trying that. And then in the other way, we see people moving from farms to cities, right? Urbanization, people moving to cities for more economic opportunities to work in these factories. We also see, and part of that is the Great Migration, what will be called the Great Migration begins. And this is African Americans who are leaving the Jim Crow South, who are tired of living under these horrible conditions with very little opportunity, economic, social, cultural, just physical opportunities to be able to live free lives. And so African Americans begin to move to the northern cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, and western cities like Oakland and LA. So huge movement by many people internally, but also externally, right? We have immigration on the West Coast, specifically from China. That's happening during the railroad building and many other opportunities that come with that, the gold rushes, the silver rushes. Ultimately, this will end with the Chinese Exclusion Act that's passed. It's called the Geary Act. It's passed in 1882, and that leads to the end of Chinese immigration. We'll talk about why that is shortly. We also see that sort of second new immigration wave, not from what we saw in the 1830s and 40s with Germany and Ireland, but here this is from sort of southern Europe, from Italy, from Greece, and from Eastern Europe, from Russia, Poland. Families like my own, who came from sort of what was then Tsarist Russia and the empire, to come to this country and settling in cities like Chicago, New York, Boston. My family went to Toronto, so go Canada. But the other thing is that because of this, obviously there's a rise of nativism, right? This push against these foreigners, right? That Chinese Exclusion Act, which, by the way, was argued for by other immigrants, like Irish especially, in San Francisco, who felt like these Chinese immigrants were taking their jobs. So how ironic is that? We have the group called the American Protective Association, which are basically a Protestant anti-Catholic group arguing to protect Americanness. And we even have some proposals about a literacy test for coming to this country, that if we had literacy tests, that would keep sort of non-English speakers out of this country. None of those actually came to pass, but interesting that they were talking about this. So some of these things that I kind of want to finish with is some of the challenges that are happening, right? So the challenges for urbanization and immigration. Obviously, cities are divided, right? By class, by race, by ethnicity. Super important to understand the divisions. Super low wages and dangerous working conditions in these cities, in these factories, where the disposability of workers was important for the leaders and managers of these businesses, who felt like we can always find someone else who will work for cheaper. We have extreme poverty, tenement buildings all out. Like, you remember How the Other Half Lives, which was that Jacob Riis photojournalism beginning, that kind of the beginning of the progressive era, that starts to show how people are living in these cities, in New York specifically, are his. Part of that is child labor, a huge reliance on child labor, because children were cheaper to pay than women, who were cheaper to pay than men. So just really not great. And we also have sort of the dominant political machines, this idea that political support can be traded for by social welfare services, that Tammany Hall in New York City and Boss Tweed, they can sort of, they'll help you out with certain things as long as you vote Democrat. And so this idea of political machines was a huge challenge for, against sort of the freedom of being able to sort of choose. And the way that I want to end this is how we sort of address those challenges, right? So economically, how do we address the challenges of this time? First, we have this idea of the gospel of wealth that Andrew Carnegie writes about, this idea that the wealthy have a moral obligation to sort of help the poor, right? Sort of pushing against this idea of social Darwinism. But in some ways, actually kind of saying that it's legitimate that they're better, but saying that it's still their obligation as the rich to help the poor. We have the settlement house movement, people like Jane Addams in Chicago, who starts the Hull House, this idea that we're going to focus on education, relieving poverty through social assistance, right? Birth control, babysitting, daycare, things that could, teaching English, this idea that they're going to help, especially the immigrant community in Chicago, to Americanize and be supported faster. We have this idea of the social gospel, that Christians had a responsibility to deal with the ills of society, specifically poverty and sickness. We have the rise of the Socialist Party, as well as the ideology of anarchism. There's no anarchist party because anarchists don't believe in hierarchies of power. But they're going to sort of challenge laissez-faire capitalism, this idea that maybe the system itself is broken. And people like Eugene V. Debs, who runs as a socialist candidate for president, gets like 1 million votes in the election of 1900, I believe. So, I mean, a lot of Americans are hearing that there's, and recognizing there's some problems. And of course, the beginning of the progressive movement that's going to happen sort of between the 1890s and then sort of 1890 into period 7, which is 1920. And into the 20s. And then, of course, the sort of addressing the social challenges, right? And so for women's rights, we have the National American Woman Suffrage Association, called NASA, this idea that we're going to fight for women's rights. We'll see that culminated in the 19th Amendment in period 7. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's been around for 50 years arguing for women's suffrage. We have the rise of a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, very important women who are arguing for women's rights. We have African American rights, finally. This idea that black journalists, black sociologists, black academics are arguing for the rise of black civil rights. We have Booker T. Washington, who we've talked about, sort of that Atlanta speech where he says, "Cast your bucket down where you are," focusing for African Americans on vocational skills. He starts the Tuskegee Institute to train African Americans on how to sort of work their way up from lower vocational skills up to sort of be respected by society. We have W.E.B. Du Bois, who rejects that and argues for black suffrage and the protection of black rights. As an academic at Harvard and in sort of other houses of education. And then finally, Ida B. Wells Barnett. Ida B. Wells Barnett arguing as a journalist against lynching. She writes an anti-lynching book, an anti-lynching campaign. She fights for women's rights, for black rights. And so these figures are very important, really good extra pieces of evidence for your DBQs. So that covers period 6. I know it was a lot, but I think you can see some of the connections and the ways in which all of these things, again, are kind of layered on top of each other. Have a good one. I'll see you in period 7.